Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Ok, grabando. Good evening and welcome to the first episode of The History of Lubrication. I'm your host, Gabriel Pericàs, and we are grateful to be recording this podcast at the wonderful space of the Emily Harvey Foundation in New York City. Now, for the record, before we begin, the title of this show, The History of Lubrication, is intentionally misleading. We are not going to talk about lubrication in general, and certainly not in terms of history. What we are going to do instead is an attempt at creating a modest cultural history of one lubricant in particular. Human saliva, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the primary lubricant, right? Or, in other words, the lubricant of the poor. But do not let the viscosity of this proposition dissuade you. We are going to dissolve this topic in a narrative pool. We're going to deliver it progressively and episodically in a hopefully entertaining manner. So stick with us and let's get started. Our first story is about a book. In 1919, Suzanne Duchamp made a painting of a book. It was based on a photograph that she took of a book hanging with strings from the railing of her balcony in Paris. The book is open and exposed to the weather, and the painting is an accurate reproduction of the photograph, only it is upside down and it features an inscription that reads, La ready-made Malloret de Marcel. For her wedding, her brother Marcel had sent her a gift from Buenos Aires. It was a textbook titled Géométrie descriptive by Louis Colros. And he sent it along with a written proposition that she hang the book outdoors to execute what he called the ready-made Malloret, which has been translated in English as the unhappy ready-made, although I think the wretched ready-made would be more appropriate, or perhaps the miserable ready-made. The geometry book was forced to interact with the contingencies of nature. The wind, the rain, and the sun all contributed to its slow degradation. The book represented a worldview that believed in universal abstractions and the rationalization of nature, and so it was punished with the unforgiving and chaotic reality of the elements. But this is not the book I want to talk about. I want to talk about another book, one that at the present time is also the victim of a Duchampian torture. A book that, just like Suzanne did to Géométrie descriptive, I have tied to the ledge of one of the windows here at the Emily Harvey Foundation. A window that faces the Soho section of New York's Broadway, where the book is, as we speak, confronted by the weather and also by the notorious stupidity in the air. The book I want to talk about shares with Géométrie descriptive that it is also an attempt to put a mathematical frock coat to the universe, as Bataille would have put it. But in the case of my book, the grounds for its punishment go beyond a vindication of the formulas and beyond an advocacy for chance and unpredictability. As we will see, they involve a libidinal incontinence, a moral imperative, and a private frustration, and other offenses that we will disclose later on. The book I want to talk about was written in 1968 by an Italian philosopher named Carmelo Ottaviano. It is an attempt at building a universal aesthetic theory. Ottaviano identified the golden ratio, the divina proporzione, as the underlying proportion governing all natural forms that he considered beautiful. And therefore, he claimed that this omnipresent law should ultimately ground all aesthetic judgment and become a standard for future technological and cultural production. But as we will see, what is remarkable about the book is not the theory in and of itself, but rather the unorthodox methodology that Ottaviano employs to prove it. Personally, I have been mildly obsessed with this book for more than a decade now, and in today's episode, I would like to tell you the somewhat convoluted story of how I ended up having it. Which, to be honest, it's not that interesting of a story. In fact, all my attempts at engaging with it got promptly interrupted or reached a dead end. So what I'm going to do to account for some of these encounters and give you an idea of the extent of my obsession is I will read a number of emails I exchanged with different people over the years discussing Ottaviano's book, in hopes that the gossipy nuance of the story captures your attention and builds up your curiosity. The first one is from 2010. I had heard about the book in 2006 during my first year at the University of Barcelona. It was mentioned in passing in a geometry class led by Professor Lino Cabezas, and 4 years later, in 2010, for a reason I will explain later, I vaguely recalled it. So I wrote an email to Professor Cabezas inquiring about it. Hello, Lino. My name is Gabriel Pericàs. I was your student in the first year of my Fine Arts Bachelor 4 years ago. I am writing because I am trying to remember this book I believe you mentioned in class once. The way I recall it, it had to do with a man who constructed the theory by drawing spirals onto images of natural phenomena. And that's pretty much what I remember, but I would love to know more about it. Thank you very much in advance. Kind regards, Gabriel. He responded promptly with a complete bibliographical reference. Dear Gabriel, I believe that the book you remember is Carmelo Ottaviano, La legge della bellezza come legge universale della natura, published by Thedam in Padova in 1970. He also pointed out that the university's library had a copy available and finished, if you would like to know more about this topic, we can meet one day to talk about it. It is one of my research interests, and I accumulate a lot of information about it. Count with my friendship and my help, Lino Cabezas. I wrote back and thanked him for the information. However, I unfortunately had to decline his offer to interview since I had just moved to study abroad in London. I told Lino I was going to try to find a copy of the book in London and that I would reach out again when I returned to Barcelona a few months later. But the truth is, I never talked to him again. During those months in London, I did, however, go to bookstores and try to find the book with the reference that Lino gave me. But none of the stores had it, nor could locate it, nor even online. As far as booksellers were concerned, the book didn't exist. And from those years, I have found a couple of emails I exchanged with a bookseller named Lucia Barahona. I was introduced to her by my friend David Bestué, who was also in London at the time doing an art residency. And Lucia had been a lover of Andrea, a friend of David from Barcelona. Both Lucia and Andrea were booksellers. Andrea worked at Laie in Barcelona, and Lucia worked at Scoop Books, which is one of the biggest second-hand bookstores in London. So David introduced me to Lucia one night, and the next day, I emailed her asking about Ottaviano's book. Hello, Lucia. This is Gabriel, David's friend. We met yesterday. This is the book I'm looking for. And I gave her all the information and ended, I hope you can find it. Thank you and a big hug, Gabriel. Now, she responded a week later saying that she couldn't find it and that neither could her boss, who was supposedly renowned for finding the rarest books. So, buying a copy seemed impossible, but the book was indeed available at the University of Barcelona's library. So when Mirari, my girlfriend at the time, came to visit, I asked her to bring that copy so at least I could see it. And I remember that when I saw it for the first time, I was slightly disappointed. At first sight, it was a dull academic book with a long essay in which Ottaviano elaborates his anachronistic theory. And the text was followed by the visual examples that he uses to prove it. But, at first the examples seemed unremarkable, but as I turned the pages, the visual examples got really bizarre. I'll describe them later. But the point is here that I thought there was something pathetic about Ottaviano's methodology that deserved a commentary. So convinced that I was going to use it for an art project, I decided to keep the book for as long as possible, thinking that the pressure of having to return it to the library would force me to complete the project. And so the next 7 emails in my search are from the university's library, demanding in a progressively more hostile tone that I return the book, which I only did a year later, in May of 2011, having done nothing with it whatsoever. And after that, I honestly forgot about it. My interest was only reborn a year and a half later, in December of 2012, because I received a message from Mercedes Mangrané, another friend from college, inquiring about it. Hey Gabriel, could you remind me of the title of that book that Lino Cabezas talked about? The one about fractals found in unexpected places? The one that you stole from the library? Now, all about her email was offensively wrong, right? The book was not about fractals found in unexpected places, and although I did borrow it for a long time, I didn't steal it from the library. And I could have said something, right? I could have corrected her, but I didn't because I didn't want her to use it for a project before I did. It was my overlooked historical anecdote to do artistic research around. So the next email is a receipt from iberlibro.com, an online used books retailer. November of 2013, I finally found and bought the book for 35 euros plus shipping to Mirari's address in Barcelona, for she was soon moving in with me in New York, where I had moved a few months earlier. So again, Mirari brings me the book, this time to New York, and 2 years later, she breaks up with me and moves back to Spain. And this was September of 2015, and I was devastated. And around that time, I exchanged a couple of bitter emails with Maya Harakawa, who worked at Triple Canopy, an online magazine. I had been given the opportunity to submit a piece about notions of publication, and I pitched this story, my capricious obsession with Ottaviano's book. Perhaps it was only obliquely related to the field of publishing, but I found it endearing and I guess metaphorical of a love story that actually had a happy ending. So I sent a draft and Maya responded skeptically with a comprehensive commentary, and among her concerns I was especially struck by this one remark. I'm not sure why you are deciding to fixate on this object, particularly given the fact that you are saying that you never read it. And that's true, I actually never read the book, I only looked at the pictures. And perhaps more importantly, she continues, I am not sure that your potential readers will find a way into this material. We have to give them a reason to care. Now, from an editorial perspective, Maya's critique was perfectly reasonable, right? She was urging me basic intelligibility, as I guess I was being obscure as to why I chose that object, and she was demanding appeal, which I understand is crucial to interrupt the audience's probable indifference. But reading her email was a sort of deja vu, for I have found myself in a position of lacking intelligibility and appeal multiple times. Back in 2010, when a script I had written was going to be published for the first time, I asked my friend Antonio Gagliano for feedback, and he pointed out the same problems. Antonio said, I see drive, but no intention. I have trouble establishing the what for or the against whom. So eventually, due to my stubborn refusal to provide an attractive rationale to frame the story, the magazine rejected my pitch and the piece was never published. And that was the last time I thought about Carmelo Ottaviano, whose book remained collecting dust on a shelf until now that I decided to use it to introduce this history of saliva. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time today, but in the next episode, the relationship between Ottaviano and spit will hopefully be apparent. Until then, please do not hesitate to send us your stories involving spit. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and visit our website or follow us on social media for updates. This was the History of Lubrication, episode number 1. I am Gabriel Pericàs. Marina Miranda here created the sound for this show, which was recorded at the Emily Harvey Foundation in New York in April of 2018. Thank you for listening. Good evening and welcome to the History of Lubrication. I'm your host, Gabriel Pericàs, and we are again recording live in front of a wonderful audience here at the Emily Harvey Foundation in New York City. Now, before we begin today's episode, I wanted to make a brief comment about the sound that we are using here for the introductions, because since the first episode aired, some people have asked me about it. It is actually an edited recording of the sound of the heater in my bedroom. It is one of these old cast iron radiators that works with water vapor, and every now and then it releases the pressure by blowing the excess through this little valve, and it makes this annoying oscillating whistle. It's unpredictable also, so every time it burst, it would startle me, right? And so it was particularly annoying while I was focused trying to write the scripts for these shows. So at some point I thought, why don't we co-opt the sound and begin each episode with it, giving thus the show the nuance of an agitating interruption. And so we incorporated the sound in lieu of a jingle, but I also thought that it sounded like the materialization of my own confidence as a writer, which also has these ups and downs. So I wrote the following joke. The valve of the radiator is blowing self-esteem. What I did was, when the valve of the radiator is blowing, it's steam, right? Steam, right? So I swapped steam to self-esteem, right? My confidence. We got it. Did it pronounce it properly? Yeah. You sure? Let's say yeah. Clearly something didn't work. We're recording your reactions to the joke. I remember. It's annoying because it's condescending. It's the other day it was like asking a friend, do you pronounce ambiguity? And she said, no, it's ambiguity, but I like how you say it. Like, what? No. I mean, it takes a lot of effort to speak another language. We're gonna cut this. We're gonna cut this from the final edit. It's alright. In the last episode, I shared with you my recursive obsession with this geometry book written in the late 60s by an Italian scholar named Carmelo Ottaviano. The book is still outside on one of the windows here at the Emily Harvey, still in pretty good shape, but slowly being torn apart by the inclement weather. Now, you remember certain people found my obsession with it uninteresting per se, so this time I used that story simply as a build-up to today's episode, in which I will be very honest about the reasons behind my own personal intermittent fascination with it. And I have consolidated those in an extensive letter addressed to Lino Cabezas, the geometry professor who made me acquainted with Ottaviano's book. I sent him a long overdue response to his last email from 2010, which he probably didn't expect at this point. And I will read that to you in a bit, but before I do, maybe it is a good idea that we examine the book in a bit more detail. By now, you must be eager to know what is so special about this, otherwise an interesting scholarly publication. Well, as I said, Ottaviano's goal was to prove the existence of this ubiquitous abstract ratio, the divina proporzione, as a structuring law for all the beautiful things of the world. And I know that in many ways this is a problematic hypothesis to begin with, right? But I will disregard that, and instead I will focus on the flimsy system that he developed to prove it. So what he did was, he took a piece of cardboard from a shoebox or something and cut spirals of it. Like not any spiral, just golden ratio spirals. And then he used those pieces of cardboard as templates to draw spirals with a Sharpie on top of found images. Now, is this strong enough evidence to support his claim? I don't know, right? I know close to nothing about concealed universal abstractions. And to his credit, some section of the spirals always matches some section of the profile of whatever is portrayed in the picture. And Ottaviano performed this operation on more than 500 images that are included in the book, organized in the following 12 categories. The first group is called plants and trees. Second group, fruits, berries, and leaves. Third group, flowers. The fourth, animals. The fifth, prehistoric animals. The sixth, the human body. The seventh, waves, waterfalls, and clouds. The eighth, eruptions of the solar corona, northern lights, and the atomic bomb. The ninth, microorganisms. The 10th, galaxies. The 11th, the beauty of the human body. Now, here is where his encyclopedic effort begins to tremble, because whereas all previous groups featured scientific-looking images, this group is comprised exclusively of images of nude women cut from erotic magazines. And finally, the 12th group, pathologies of organisms, which includes two kinds of images, decaying trees and naked human bodies of either fat or skinny people, and unsurprisingly, upon these images, the spirals don't fit. The count so far is 541 images with spirals on them, sometimes even multiple spirals. So it was already absurd enough, right? But it gets worse. Because in the third accresciuta, or extended edition of the book, there is a 13th group called Ancora, which in this case translates as wait, there is more, the beauty of the human body. And it features 50 gratuitous extra photographs of nude women from erotic magazines with spirals on their faces, their breasts, and their buttocks. Now, the misogynist objectification of the female body here comes as no surprise, right? And even less so within the one-dimensional mindset of a book, which at the end of the day is about standardization. What is surprising is the blatant, preposterous, and justified excess of erotic imagery and how he got away with it, right? I've been thinking, and the only circumstance under which this would be explicable would be if the book had only one goal, and it was to serve as camouflage for the circulation of sexually arousing images among the fellow academic men of Padova, who also need to masturbate and most likely lack imagination. In any case, now that you know the secret of the book, let me read to you the email I sent to my professor. Dear Lino, this is Gabriel Pericàs. In 2006, I was in the geometry class that you taught at the School of Fine Arts in Barcelona. Back then, you mentioned a book that has been stuck in my mind for the last 12 years. In 2010, I wrote you an email inquiring about it. You were very generous with me, and yet I left your message unresponded. Now, 8 years later, I want to right that wrong. The book I'm referring to is La legge della bellezza como legge universale della natura by Carmelo Ottaviano. I'm sure you remember it. In it, Ottaviano tries to prove that there is a universal law based on the golden ratio that structures the beautiful things in the world. And at the end, he includes slightly pornographic images of women. Now, I'm sure the general idea behind this theory was widespread, because on the one hand, it's such an appealing idea, right? It entices our primal longing for certainty. It revokes the idea that the world is simple, purposeless chaos. Who doesn't like that? And on the other hand, it is kind of convincing, right? If they show you all these images of shells of snails and things like that. But I'm sure Carmelo Ottaviano was not the only advocate of it. So why did you bring this particular book to the attention of your students? Is it only due to this paradoxical use of lustful images within the otherwise rational and pure field of geometry? Before I hear your answers, however, I would like to share with you the particular reasons behind my own recurring fascination with this book. These days, I'm trying to use Ottaviano as an example of what I call an unhappy academic man, which is a facile symbolic figure that antagonizes the thinking of George Bataille, which I'm using to ground my current research about human saliva. But this is a longer story. When I wrote to you back in 2010, my interest in Ottaviano was more superficial. I'd made this spontaneous virtual performance that I regarded as a reflection upon my responsibility as a young art practitioner. One day, I was practicing cybersex. I was masturbating on Skype with a friend of mine, and in the midst of it, perhaps pushed by a constant surreptitious sense of guilt, I asked my friend if she would try and rotate one of her breasts over itself. Now, that request was not a fetish of mine. It was supposed to be an artistic gesture, right? The thing is, I found the reciprocal interruption of sexual gratification and art making an interesting problem to tackle. And that, along with the spiral-like shape that formed on my friend's twisted breast, reminded me of Ottaviano's book, because even though I didn't mention it in my email, I did remember the erotic images covered in spirals that you showed us in class. Some years later, I returned to the book, but in that occasion I overlooked the sexual aspect of it. I focused on Ottaviano's belief in a universal structure governing the visible world, which I thought deserved criticism in and of itself, but most importantly, I was interested in his method of overlaying schematic drawings onto photographs. I found that a superposition aimed at uncovering an underlying abstraction is an ironic idea. Lino, have you seen my work? I was somewhat known when I lived in Barcelona. Now I live in New York and nobody knows about me. But recently I made a series of sculptures replicating the structure used by a street magician to perform levitation stunts, and I'm quite satisfied with them. And guess what? They were inspired by schematic drawings on photographs. The drawings that informed my sculptures, however, were only unveiling a hidden mechanical structure, nothing comparable to Ottaviano's unveiling of an absolute universal structure. However, in my mind, both the idiots who reveal magic tricks on the internet and Ottaviano share, on the one hand, the faith that there is a truth concealed behind the visible, immediate reality, and on the other hand, an urgency to share that truth with the world. There is something that is very masculine about this entitlement to convince others of your worldview, and Ottaviano's indulgent in his bombastic heterosexual libido makes this very apparent. Now, this may sound like a tangent to you, but in Brooklyn, near where I live, there is a street named after John Hancock, one of the signees of the United States Declaration of Independence. He is remembered because his signature on it was so flamboyant that his name became synonym of signature in the US. People say, put your John Hancock on this document, please, right? So, and if you look at it, it is true that his is by far the biggest and more embellished of all signatures. So, a couple days ago, I was waiting for a friend at the intersection of Tompkins and Hancock, and my friend was late, so I couldn't help noticing that the name Hancock on the street sign sounded a lot like Handcock, which would be the name, I thought, given to a person who, instead of two hands, would have been born with one hand and at the tip of the other arm, instead of a hand, would have a penis, right? And I thought, well, if I was Carmelo Ottaviano, that would be very convenient. I could simply use that extra penis to write my book. People would call me Carmelo Handcock Ottaviano. Carmelo Handcock Ottaviano, like how it sounds. Then my friend arrived and I shared with her my Handcock observation, and she said she found it amusing, but unfortunately, she said, it is in fact incorrect. Because in English, she said, it is the former word of a compound word, the one that acts as a qualifying modifier of the latter. This is why, she said, Spider-Man is a man with certain attributes that are most commonly seen in spiders. Spider-Man, she asked me, is not a spider with human characteristics, is he? I said, no, he isn't. Consequently, she continued, Handcock would be the name of a person who, instead of two hands, would have been born with one hand at the tip of each arm, plus an additional third hand in between his legs, where you would normally expect the penis. But hey, she said, it's fine, I like how you say it. Ultimately, the version that she proposed was even better, right? Because if I was Carmelo Ottaviano, I'm sure a third hand would be very convenient, to hold my templates in place. So, dear Lino, let's call him Carmelo Hancock Ottaviano. Indeed, Carmelo Hancock Ottaviano. But don't get me wrong, Lino. Ottaviano being horny doesn't bother me. I personally take libidinal farces very seriously, and I'm not judgmental of people using them to fuel their research. In his case in particular, I actually find it adorable, the pathetic image of him going to a news stand somewhere in Rome in the late 1960s and purchasing a pile of soft porn magazines while telling the guy at the counter, no, you don't understand. This is actually research. It's for a thing at the university you don't understand. It's for geometry purposes. And then, the image of him going back to his apartment on Via Mesopotamia 21. I do know his address. I'm not going to tell you how I found out. Going back to his apartment, where he would sit in a room, alone, in his apartment on Via Mesopotamia 21, I would take out his templates and draw spirals on the pages. Look at the geometric abstractions behind these images, while slobbering. This form follows the Divina Proporzione. I think this is a universal truth right here. Like the sad fascist man he chose to be. I hope you're doing well otherwise, Lino. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Best regards, Gabriel. That was the email I sent to Lino Cabezas, but unfortunately we reached the end of our episode today. I'll keep you posted if he responds. In the meantime, please keep sending your stories and general ideas about spit to spit@thehistoryoflubrication.org. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and visit our website where you can support us by purchasing the limited edition coffee mug for $20, domestic shipping included. This was The History of Lubrication, episode number 2. I am Gabriel Pericàs. Marina Miranda created the sound for this show, which was recorded at the Emily Harvey Foundation in New York in April of 2018. Thank you for listening. So when you drink, people think that you're drinking saliva. All right. Good evening and welcome once again to The History of Lubrication. I'm your host, Gabriel Pericàs, and we are recording this podcast at the Emily Harvey Foundation in New York City. Today is the long-awaited day when we begin to address the main topic of this show. It is actually going to be along with a few last remarks on Ottaviano, but we are finally going to talk about spit. Before we do that though, I want to explain a little misunderstanding I had here with the audience that somehow got leaked and now people is going around saying that I'm an arrogant artist. I'm not, right? And the thing is that for some reason I often have bad luck with audiences, but I relate to audiences far more often as another audience member than I do as a performer, right? For instance, recently I attended this really beautiful flamenco concert here in the city, and right in the row in front of me, I had this group of people which embodied a portable anthology of audience misbehavior, right? They were talking among themselves, they were coughing, they were looking at their phones. But the worst part was how the three of them spent the whole concert writing. Yeah, they had pens and they had a stack of papers that they kept shuffling around, and every time that something noteworthy happened on stage, they had to note it down. They had established this little assignment for themselves. I had to write this down before I forget or something. And one of them, in order to see what she was writing, she used the screen light of her cell phone to illuminate the paper, which in the full darkness of the theater, you can imagine it was so annoying. So I was really upset, moving furious in my seat, about to yell at them, when I finally remembered one of the stories that you guys had sent me. It was Flora from Paris. And she said, when we were children, instead of spitting at each other at school, we would put a little bit of saliva on our fingertips and gently place it with slyness on our target's shoulder. Thus, we fulfilled our desire to humiliate the other, but we did so in an extraordinarily civilized way that prevented retaliation. So, in between songs, I pat the shoulder of that woman, and she turns around, right? And I hesitated a bit, but finally I whispered, "Excuse me, may I borrow your pen for a second?" And she didn't even find it weird, right? And she said, "Of course." And then she gave it to me, and obviously I didn't need to write anything. So instead, I took the pen and I licked it a bit. Like that, like it was a lollipop. And of course, she didn't see it. And then I returned it and I just said, "Thank you." And that was it. They kept being annoying, but somehow I felt that I had won that battle. Now, during the recording of the last episode, I had a little confrontation here with the audience, right? This time as the performer. The script I had written included a couple of jokes in the traditional sense, right, with punchlines. And basically, I have an audience here, so they laugh at the jokes, so we can record the laughter and add it in the edit that eventually goes online. Now, this event was cut out from the final podcast, but basically, I had to call them out for not laughing enough, right? I took off my headphones and I talked to them directly, which I usually don't do, and just to ask if they could please cooperate a bit more. And unexpectedly, that address they found more amusing, and they laughed while that. And wow, he's breaking the invisible wall, right? Wow, what a smart use of the distanciation effect, ha. And later in the episode, I made another joke that didn't get a laugh either, and so I made the gesture of like addressing them again, right? Only the gesture, and there I got the laugh, right? Only by pretending that I was gonna talk to them again. And you know, this was all planned, right? It's called a Pavlovian conditioning, and interestingly enough, in its origin, it's had a very direct relationship with spit. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who was studying the role of saliva in the digestive system of dogs. And to analyze it, he obviously needed to collect samples, right? So what he did was he showed food to the dogs, which provoked salivation to begin, and then he redirected the flow of saliva to this test tube that he had strategically placed on the commissure of their lips. So all overflow was collected in the tubes, and they measured it, and then they put the tubes in the freezer and made popsicles. No, they didn't. Of course they didn't. That would be very gross, right? But I honestly wonder if it's frozen. I know it's dog spit, but if it's frozen, is it still that gross, right? And it's an issue that I'm genuinely interested in, and I will definitely explore further in future episodes: saliva and temperature. But what happened to Pavlov was that he observed that the dogs who had been at his laboratory before somehow expected to be given food and therefore began salivating before the food was brought out. Pavlov noticed this, and that's when he conducted his famous experiment. You probably have heard about this before. He asked for a new dog to be brought into the lab, and he presented the dog with stimuli that were unrelated to food. He played a metronome or rang a bell, and right after, he gave food to the dog, resulting in the production of saliva. And he repeated this procedure several times, and so that the dog ended up establishing an inevitable connection between the bell and the food, so that eventually the salivation of the dog was activated by the sound of the bell alone. Now, what I find the most interesting about this story is that it features saliva in one of my favorite capacities, which is as a material manifestation of a desire. One that, moreover, is inevitable, right? The pathos of the dog is that it lacks the basic ability to conceal its appetite. So I was reading about all this and I thought, oh, this might have something to do with Carmelo Ottaviano. So I drafted a follow-up email to Lino, who, by the way, hasn't responded yet to the elaborate email I sent him. And so I wrote, "Dear Lino, how possible do you think it is that Ottaviano was attempting to condition himself in a Pavlovian way, insisting in the association of geometry and erotic images up until the geometry alone became sexually arousing, so that research was more appealing? Or perhaps the other way around, he was only turned on by the geometry, so he was placing spirals on naked people over and over until he could become aroused by the people. Either way, I imagine him lacking the basic ability to handle his own libido. I imagine his mouth flooded with saliva, like the dog he is. Sincerely, Gabriel." P.S. I recently learned from Roberto Bolaño about this ready-made that Marcel and Suzanne Duchamp made in 1919, involving the punishment of a geometry book by forcing it to interact with the chaotic forces of nature. I did the same to Ottaviano's Lino, and additionally, I allowed people to spit on it to add an extra bit of shame. I obviously never send this email, right? Because at the end of the day, my hatred for Ottaviano is only theatrical, right? And from now on, I think I'm going to abandon this pretended hostility against him, which was really a satirical reaction to that accusation from the first episode, if you remember, saying that my work lacks a target, lacks an against whom. And I say that by now, if you don't know who the patsy is, perhaps you are the patsy. Now, the second part of the PS was not theatrical. When we finish this recording, we're going to open the window and we'll let the spectators here spit on the book if they want to express their own dislike. But if they decide to do it, they will need to aim accurately, because since they will be spitting out the window, if they miss their target, they will be spitting directly onto Broadway. Maybe hitting a random innocent passerby who is shopping unwary, which I'll find amusing, nonetheless. But we're getting off topic here. What I wanted to talk about in today's episode is the text that really triggered my interest in saliva, and now we only have time for a brief introduction. It is the extensive definition that Michel Léry offered in 1929 in Volume 1, Issue 7 of the Surrealist magazine Documents. In the same issue, George Bataille famously defined the formless, and in his definition he mentions spit as a paradigmatic example of the formless. As you know, for Bataille, formless was a derogative and disparaging term often used to create the illusion of a hierarchy, where the formless goes at the bottom, so form, abstraction, metaphysics, and so on can go at the top. He says for academics to be satisfied, it would be necessary, in effect, for the universe to take on a form. The whole philosophy has no other aim. It is a question of fitting what exists into a mathematical frock coat. And you can hear Ottaviano being summoned here. To affirm, on the contrary, that Bataille continues that the universe is only formless amounts to saying that the universe is akin to a gob of spittle. So Bataille uses spit simply as an instantiation of something defamatory, which is a property of saliva that we have already covered. But as I said, in the same issue, Michel Léry offers an extensive and more complex definition of saliva. I will just summarize it today, but we will get back to it in future episodes. Léry exposes two meanings. The first one he names the spittle soul, and it refers to the symbolic duality of saliva, from insult, as we have covered, to miracle, which is the other side of the coin, right? And the second meaning he calls the mouth water, and in it he points to the capacity of saliva to completely disrupt the hierarchical order with which we classify the organs of the body, right? The act of spitting, Léry argues, turns the mouth into an organ of excretion, thus devaluating its otherwise honorable role as a source of speech, the conspicuous sign of intelligence. Léry says, indeed, what value can we attach to reason or speech, and consequently to man's presumed dignity, when we consider that given the identical source of language and spit, any philosophical discourse can be figured by the incongruous image of a spluttering speaker. Now, this quote was constitutional for this show, and it's a pity that we don't have more time to unpack it as we run out of time today. In the next episode, I will report on whether the book gets spat on or else whatever ends up happening to it. And in the meantime, please keep sending your material about saliva to spit@thehistoryoflubrication.org. Subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media for updates. Do not forget to support us by purchasing the limited edition coffee mug of the show for $20, domestic shipping included. This was The History of Lubrication, episode number 3. I am Gabriel Pericàs. All sound was created live by Marina Miranda here at the Emily Harvey Foundation in New York, where the show was recorded in April of 2018. As always, goodbye, and thank you for listening.